Well, in this lesson, we are going to hear about the George H.W. Bush administration. Now, normally I could care two hoots if you remember a person's first name, but I'm afraid with the Bush administration, we have to remember that it's George H.W. because his son, George W., is going to win in 2000. So we're going to have to be a little careful that we put these down in our notes. When George H.W. Bush was elected, the United States is going through a very robust economy. It is not our greatest economy that we have ever had, but it is an economy that, considering where it had been a decade earlier, has incredibly gone up. Mao Zedong is going to die in 1976. This would be during the administration of Gerald Ford. Mao is going to be replaced by Deng Xiaoping. Remember, in the Chinese language, X's are pronounced like Z's. Deng is going to call for reforms in both Chinese politics and the Chinese economy. Now, young people agreed with Deng. They believed that the policies that Deng was talking about would help them out. Prices are going to begin to rise. Hardline communists are concerned that Deng's policy is going to cause problems. In Tiananmen Square, which is in the center of the capital city of Beijing, young people began to congregate. They began to talk about reforms. Now, these young people had a great deal of respect for Deng, but they did not have much respect for the Communist Party. Well, Deng is put between a rock and a hard place. Yes, he loves the students, but if he doesn't do something to shut them down, the hardliners will turn against him. Deng is going to call for the military to clear the square. It is unknown how many people died during the Tiananmen Square massacre. What we do know is that thousands were killed and tens of thousands will be imprisoned. China, at this point, will take control of all communication in the country of China.
The noise of gunfire rose from all over the center of Peking. It was unremitting. On the streets leading down to the main road to Tiananmen Square, furious people stared in disbelief at the glow in the sky, listening to the sound of shots. Heading down the road was a hazardous business, but hundreds of people cheered as buses were set alight and army trucks caught fire too. They yelled and shouted. And then, as troop lorries were seen moving down the road, there was gunfire from those lorries.
The troops have been firing indiscriminately, but still, there are thousands of people on the streets who will not move back.
The bicycle rickshaws scooped up the injured, others were shunted onto bikes and pedaled to hospital. Many were carried away by frantic local residents. There was confusion and despair among those who could hardly credit that their own army was firing wildly at them. Many were bystanders, perhaps naive about the savagery of the situation. Indeed, it was hard at times to grasp that this army was launching into an unarmed civilian population as if charging into battle. From Tiananmen Square, the sound of gunfire sounded like a battle, but it was one-sided. A line of soldiers was strung out facing a huge crowd. The air was filled with shouts of "Fascists! Stop killing!" We were in the line facing the troops. They were about 250 yards away. Young people were singing the Internationale to a background of gunfire.
After hours of shooting, and facing a line of troops, the crowd is still here. They're shouting, "Stop the killing and down with the government."
A huge volley of shots just as I left the front line caused panic. The young man in front of me fell dead. I fell over him. 2 others were killed yards away. 2 more people lay wounded on the ground near me. Ambulances screamed up to the troop line and were turned away. They couldn't get to the square. 2 ambulance drivers were shot and injured. Earlier, we'd been driving at the back of the Forbidden City, the old part of Peking, near the square. We picked up a woman with a bullet in the head and took her to the nearby children's hospital, into a scene of near mayhem. Casualties were arriving every few seconds, on bikes, rickshaws, park benches, carried in, all with gunshot wounds. Housewives, elderly residents, people shot while sitting in their homes. The operating theatre was overflowing, many of the staff in tears. In 20 minutes, 40 seriously injured were brought for emergency surgery. 2 were already dead. In the streets, many came up to us, shaking with anger and disbelief and fear. Many were terrified, saying there would be retribution. There was not one voice on the streets which did not express despair and rage. Tell the world, they said to us.
Well, again, we don't know how bad Tiananmen Square was. We do know that if you go to China today, it's impossible to look up anything about Tiananmen Square in their history books, on Google or such. During the Reagan administration, Iran and Iraq had been at war for almost 10 years. In 1988, Iraq is victorious over a much bigger in population Iran. George H.W. Bush had been a product of the American system. He was part of the American dream.
He is known as Papa Bush or Bush the Elder. Welcome to WatchMojo.com, and today we'll be learning more about the life and accomplishments of George H.W. Bush.
But the biggest thing that has happened in the world, in my life, in our lives, is this. By the grace of God, America won the Cold War.
George Herbert Walker Bush was born June 12, 1924 in Milton, Massachusetts, to Prescott Sheldon Bush and his wife Dorothy. Raised in a politically inclined and affluent household, Bush was sent to a select Massachusetts boarding school where he assumed leadership roles like senior class president and varsity team captain. Bush delayed his college plans after 1941's Pearl Harbor attack. Instead, he enrolled in the U.S. Navy, where he became the youngest pilot to that point. During his stint, Bush almost died when his plane was bombed over the Pacific. He returned to the States, where he married Barbara Pierce and earned an honorable discharge in 1945. He soon finished his education at Yale by earning a BA in economics in 2.5 years. At school, he joined teams and organizations, including the famous secret society Skull and Bones. The Bush family also welcomed the first of their 6 children, George Walker. Following Bush Sr.'s 1948 graduation, the family relocated to Texas, where he joined the oil industry and quickly made his millions. By 1964, he was more interested in politics than business. Bush aimed for a state Senate seat, but his Democratic opposition painted him as a conservative fanatic, and he lost. 2 years later, he began a 2-year term in the House of Representatives, where he commonly upheld right-wing interests, but did vote in favor of 1968's Civil Rights Act.
The tough votes are the ones that you just agonize on, and then you do what you think is right.
Bush also supported Nixon's Vietnam strategy and voted to abolish the draft as a House Ways and Means Committee member. After another failed Senate run in 1970, Bush jumped from ambassador to the United Nations to head of the Republican National Committee. Nixon's successor Gerald Ford then made Bush an official envoy to China. His success there led to his appointment as head of the Central Intelligence Agency in 1976.
Old-fashioned as it may seem to some, it is my duty to serve my country. And I didn't seek this job, but I want to do it, and I'll do my very best.
But he left when Democrat Jimmy Carter took office the next year. Bush stood out as a candidate for the Republican presidential ticket in 1980, but he lost to Ronald Reagan after a fierce campaign. The conservative Reagan then chose the moderate Bush as his running mate, and the pair won the election. As vice president, Bush headed important task forces and supported Reagan in his policy decisions. He became the first VP to become acting president when Reagan underwent colon surgery in July 1985. By then, Bush had decided to run for president in 1988. In 1986, the Reagan administration was tarnished by the Iran-Contra scandal. Bush did not allow this to derail his presidential dreams. He and Dan Quayle fought a nasty campaign against Democrat Michael Dukakis. After a memorable speech at the '88 Republican National Convention, Bush became the first sitting vice president since 1836 to be elected. On January 20th, 1989, George H.W. Bush was inaugurated the 41st president of the United States.
And that brings us to some of the problems of the Bush administration. Now, Bush is going to have to deal with Saddam Hussein. Saddam Hussein was the dictator who ran Iraq. Now, after defeating the Iranians, Saddam Hussein saw himself as the next great Persian emperor. Now, if you go back into the Bible, if you go into Hellenistic or Greek history, you hear a lot about the Persians. That's how Saddam Hussein saw himself. The first step for Saddam Hussein was to take over the country of Kuwait. Now, Kuwait is a very small country. It is located where the Tigris and the Euphrates River enter the Persian Gulf. Strategically, it is important for Iraq to have control of Kuwait. And in 1990, Iraq will invade Kuwait. Now, there are those who said this is not right. The United States is going to go before the United Nations and ask for a military response. 40 different countries will agree to help, and the United States will take the lead in both the number of troops and leadership. Now, the idea is to kick Iraq back into Iraq. In the war, Kuwait will be liberated, and the United States will drive very deep into Iraq. Saddam Hussein will agree to a peace treaty, and most of his army is going to be destroyed.
Saddam Hussein called this the mother of all battles. Welcome to WatchMojo.com, and today we'll be learning more about the Persian Gulf War.
Should military action be required, this will not be another Vietnam. This will not be a protracted, drawn-out war.
Relations between the United States and Iraq were strained for years due to Iraq's alliance with the Soviet Union during the Cold War and their stance on other world conflicts. Despite this, the U.S. helped Iraq in the war against Iran during the 1980s. While this battle helped build Iraq into an important power, it also left the country broke. In addition, Iraq's economy suffered because of low oil prices they blamed on overproduction by Kuwait. In July 1990, Saddam Hussein's regime threatened military action should they continue. Saddam also hoped to erase the debt his country owed Kuwait after the Iran-Iraq War. He wished to expand Iraq's presence in the Middle East by controlling Kuwait's huge oil reserves and by annexing the whole country. Due to the region's history, he already considered Kuwait as part of Iraq. The neighboring countries failed to find a compromise, so Iraq launched a surprise invasion of Kuwait on August 2nd, 1990. Saddam claimed victory within a couple of days. Meanwhile, the United Nations hoped for a quick and diplomatic end to this occupation. Iraq refused a UN request to withdraw, so the country was put under a total trade embargo. At this point, the United States under George H.W. Bush worried that by invading Kuwait, Iraq had gained easier access to neighboring Saudi Arabia and its vast oil reserves. The U.S. hoped to contain Iraqi influence and prevent Saddam's regime from controlling the majority of the world's oil. On August 7th, the U.S. and a coalition of Western allies deployed troops to Saudi Arabia in a mission called Operation Desert Shield. This military action was based on an earlier plan created by the Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Central Command, General Norman Schwarzkopf, otherwise known as Stormin' Norman. In November, the UN gave Iraq a deadline of January 15th to withdraw from Kuwait. Otherwise, the coalition would be permitted to respond with force. Until January, the US-led coalition presence in the region grew to include soldiers from 34 countries, including Saudi Arabia, the United Kingdom, and Egypt. This group was led by Schwarzkopf. On January 16, 1991, when Saddam's military remained in Kuwait, Operation Desert Storm began.
5 months ago, Saddam Hussein started this cruel war against Kuwait. Tonight, the battle has been joined.
Coalition forces had a significant technological lead over their opponents, so this aerial offensive saw the demolition of Iraq's air support as well as much of its infrastructure and important buildings. Iraq responded tactically by attacking Israel with Scud missiles. Saddam assumed he could cripple the coalition with this move because Israel had a policy of retaliation. He knew the Arab nations in the coalition would never fight alongside Israel, and so if he was able to bring them into the fray, he would also be forcing those various Arab countries to leave the coalition. However, President Bush convinced Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Shamir not to respond. Iraq continued its missile attack while the coalition initiated the war's ground phase in an attempt to liberate Kuwait. Operation Desert Saber saw coalition forces move from Saudi Arabia to Kuwait and finally to Iraq. Though the ground forces of both sides were seen as relatively equal, the Iraqi stronghold collapsed within a few days. On February 28, 1991, President Bush announced the end of hostilities.
Kuwait is liberated. Iraq's army is defeated. Our military objectives are met.
Iraq agreed to acknowledge Kuwait as a distinct nation and to rid itself of weapons of mass destruction. However, Iraq failed to fully cooperate with those directives. This eventually led to the invasion of Iraq by the United States under George W. Bush in 2003 and the ensuing Iraq War. 1991's relatively short Gulf War resulted in significant Iraqi civilian and military deaths and fewer than 400 coalition military casualties. However, as many as 250,000 of the almost 700,000 coalition soldiers who served developed an illness called Gulf War Syndrome, purportedly due to the use of chemical weapons. This was one of the first wars to be covered live by television media. Because of this and its impact on world history, the significance of the Gulf War resonated well into the 21st century.
Well, George H.W. Bush had made a promise that he would not raise taxes, but the war had been so expensive that in 1992, Bush was forced to call for higher taxes. The Republicans in 1992 renominated George H.W. Bush for president of the United States. The Democrats are going to turn to Arkansas Governor Bill Clinton. Now, Clinton is going to stress the economy. Every chance he gets to make a speech, Clinton is going to talk about the economy. Clinton is going to talk about higher taxes, how our money isn't going as far. In fact, there was a famous sign above the entrance to Clinton's campaign headquarters in Little Rock. It simply said, "It's the economy, stupid, it's the economy." There were those who did not support either Clinton or Bush. Instead, they wanted to support this man here, Ross Perot. Now, Ross Perot was a multi-billion-dollar Texan, and Perot decided he was going to run as a third-party candidate. So in 1992, it is Bush, the Republican, Clinton, the Democrat, and Perot, the independent. Perot's message was quite simple. He did not believe that Reaganomics was working. This is a commercial from Perot's campaign.
It is called trickle-down economics. It assumes lower taxes on the rich create prosperity that trickles down to all the American people. Instead of a sound economic principle, it turned out to be political voodoo. Trickle-down simply didn't trickle. In this election, you can vote for a candidate who has the experience to put the free enterprise system to work for the people, creating jobs. building businesses. A candidate who will not play politics, but will get down to the business of expanding the tax base, reducing the national debt, putting America back to work. This is no time to waste our votes on politics as usual. It is time for a candidate who will get down to business. It is time for Ross Perot.
Bush had been hurt badly by his no new taxes idea. The Democrats came out and supported Clinton, and Perot's going to take just enough votes away from Bush that Clinton will be elected president of the United States. The red states are Mr. Bush. The blue states are Mr. Clinton. You can see in popular votes, the bottom pie chart, that Clinton did not receive a majority. However, he received more votes than either Bush or Perot. You can see in electoral college votes, it is a fairly easy victory for President Clinton. Well, we are done with today's work. I would remind you that you have until 11:59 tonight to submit your answers.